Hi everyone. Today we're going to be discussing Derek Walcott and Omeros. Walcott was a 1992 Nobel Prize for Literature Award winner and the first one from the Caribbean. He is a Caribbean poet. Um, he has a very interesting rhyme scheme in Omeros. It's the ABA, BCB, CDC rhyme scheme. It's called the terza rima, and that's Italian, meaning three line rhyme scheme. Rhyme scheme. Oh boy, I can't talk today. And that was actually invented by anyone? Anyone? Dante. Yes, which should tell you how interested Walcott was in classical traditional writers. Um, so let's kind of think about some discussion and some lecture on this. So, in his essay Meanings, published in 1970, Walcott wrote of a dualism in his work as a split writer. He's divided between like narrative and gestural on the one hand, and the literary and classical on the other hand. So, his work reflects a struggle to discover historical heroes for his nation, people who could compete with traditional European monuments. And I think that's very interesting given the multicultural um, just giant melting pot that is the Caribbean. So he was trained initially as a painter, as I'm sure you know, and you'll probably note a disparity between the oral performative and the visual calligraphic in his work. In an interview, he commented that metaphor is almost calligraphic. When it is pronounced, you can almost see it, explaining that his entire childhood was based on a race, quote, renaming something that had been named by someone else and giving that object its own metaphoric power. Does that sound familiar to anybody? Because it really sounds familiar to me. Our other author, Achebe, seemed to do that in the Nigerian writer. He used those English words and kind of wanted to assign different meanings to them and to trivialize them in English. I thought that was very interesting. So, in a story called Crusoe's Journal, Walcott uses a painterly language to describe his people's gestural and performative acts to adopt Western rituals and myths. They recite the New Testament and they receive the Eucharist, or as it said, parroting our Master's style and voice, we learn to eat the flesh of Christ. And that's from lines 20 through 26. They embrace and recant the colonial works by Henty, Marriott, and R.L.S., and they fashion a new culture out of the debris washed ashore. And that's lines 36 through 42 and 50 through 56. How does Walcott's painterly writing compare to the practice of ekphrasis, in which objects are described through rich poetic description, like the Shield of Achilles, Ode on a Grecian Urn? And what benefit does painterly writing serve for the reader? So when I think about ekphrasis, I think from, it's the rendering from one poetic form to another. So from a picture, a painting, from a painting, a poem. So, and it usually comes with some sort of an epiphany. All of the E words there, all the E words. um, so yes, I thought that that was kind of an interesting part. The other thing is that when you read Omeros, um, you might want to read him instead of, reading line by line by line as though it were a poem. Instead, because it sounds like this, Achille looked up at the hole the laurel had left. He saw the hole silently healing with the foam of a cloud like a breaker. Then he saw the swift crossing the cloud surf, a small thing far from its home, confused by the waves of blue hills. A thorn vine gripped his heel, he tugged it free. Around him other ships were shaping from the saw. With his cutlass he made a swift sign of the cross, his thumb touching his lips. While the height rang with axes, he swayed back the blade. So instead of saying things like that, read it instead as though it were not in stanzas. Read it as though it were a story. So let's start from Let's see. Let's start from line 13. The bearded elders endured the decimation of their tribe without uttering a syllable of the language they uttered as one nation. The speech taught their saplings. From the towering babble of the cedar to green vowels of bois campêche, the bois flotte held its tongue, and the laurier cannelle, the red-skinned logwood, endured the thorns of its flesh, while the arawak's patois crackled in the smell of a ruinous bonfire that turned the leaves brown with curling tongues, then ash, and their language was lost. So it sounds a little bit better if you just read it like it's a story. Like barbarians striding columns, they have brought down the fishermen. They have brought down. The fishermen shouted. The gods were down at last. So think of it more as a story and less as just a straight up poem. The next thing I wanted to talk about is a theme that runs through Walcott's work. Um, in another work of his, The Ruins of a Great House, Walcott revisits the decaying architecture of a former slave plantation as a place for the Bible and sword, where imperial explorers such as Raleigh and Drake are rotten like the limes, quote, whose stench became the Charnel galleon's text, unquote. That's line 36. In North and South, New York City becomes the epitome of Western oppression and colonization, from ancient through modern times. Quote, even when spring comes with its rains of nails, the world will be one season older but no wiser, unquote. So New York is like Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a foreign land where the poet longs for home. The cacophonous seaports, built ironically around a British colonial monument, um, as the poet drifts southward into Virginia, additional references are made to the Holocaust and Nazi regime. Um, the bread truck breaks like a broken swastika. The KKK is compared to the Gestapo, and racial tension is apparent in the cashier's reaction as she places change in his hands. So think about the idea of affliction throughout Omeros. So, and also I wonder whether or not you enjoy like the recycling of Western myths and history into like this whole new Caribbean work. Not everybody does. Some people think that it's kind of confusing. So let's move on to some activities which might be helpful. The first thing that I, of course, would ask you to do is something that really comes to mind for me, and that's part of understanding myth. I would compare the Achilles of Homer's The Iliad to Derek Walcott's Achilles. So Greek heroes displayed courage, valor, and honor in battle, and loyalty to their nation and their fellow warriors, and they sought glory. In Greek myth, Achilles, who incidentally his name means grief of the people, he was born of a nymph and Myrmidon, sorry. He was physically immortal, except for his heel, because that's the potty part that his mother Thetis used. She was holding onto it when she dipped him into the river Styx to make him immortal. So when you say Achilles heel, that's my weak spot, my Achilles heel. That's what you're talking about. And we actually have our body part named after it. Um, anyway, Homer depicts Achilles as the greatest, but also as the most wrathful warrior. And he possessed superior armor fashioned by the god Hephaestus. Um, so see if you have familiarity um, with the Iliad, I would definitely compare those two. And don't be above looking in Wikipedia. You know, do a search for the Odyssey and the Iliad. Um, I don't think you have time to read all of the Iliad, and it's kind of long and epic, but definitely worth it. And then kind of, give a little comparison between those very interesting characters. So the next thing that I would do is listen to and read about Derek Walcott's attack on V.S. Naipaul's writing. Um, and I'm going to give you whatchamacallit, a URL. I'll put a hypertext link into the response as well for this. It's called www.radioopensource.org/CALABASH dash 08 dash FIRST dash THE dash fireworks. All right. So what is the bone that Walcott has to pick with Naipaul's writing? If you were to interview him on his criticism, what questions would you ask him? So it's kind of that's a big one, and it requires listening to another lecture. But I think that it's important, and I think that it is definitely worth it. So that's radioopensource.org /calabash 08 first the fireworks. So here's some other ideas. Discuss Walcott's references to one of the following in the anthology poems, either the Holocaust, Greek mythology, or American history and politics, which you'll find all three of those. Think of the theme, here's another one. Think of the themes of forgetfulness and affliction in his poems, and then kind of tease out a couple of different examples, probably 2 examples of each, or 4 examples of one. The next would be, how is landscape used as a symbol in Derek Walcott's poetry? Provide at least 4 examples of that. And so by symbol, I mean, if there is a windy day, oftentimes that would symbolize change. If there is, like when you were reading The Dead, the setting, all of that snow, symbolizing that death. That I think would be a good example. You could even do a comparison between the setting of The Dead and Omeros. And then finally, Senghor, Leopold Senghor, remember the Senegalese president? He visited New York City, and so did Walcott, and both of them wrote of their experiences there. So think of the poet's response to the metropolis in Senghor's New York, which is on page 683, and Walcott's North and South, which is on pages 954 to 955. So how does each poet use style, content, and topography to describe his experiences? Well, I hope this gives you kind of an idea about Walcott. I think he's very interesting. My husband actually took a class from him at Hampshire College in Boston, gosh, back in the early 90s, but not during the controversy. Okay, so you guys have a great one, and I will talk to you soon.